My name is Tanner Foster. I'm 33 years old, and my parents ignored my birthday again this year. No call, no text, not a single word. Just complete silence on the day I turned 33. It wasn't the first time, but this time it cut deeper. While they poured all their time, energy, and resources into my younger sister, the one they've always called their genius, I was treated like the daughter who didn't need anything, the one who was always okay on her own. I built a solid career as a software engineer here in Minneapolis. My family lives in Edina, just 20 minutes away, but the emotional distance between us feels like miles. This year, I finally did something for myself. A few days after my birthday, I bought a supercar. I paid cash in full. I posted one simple photo online. Nothing flashy, just a quiet moment for me. Then my phone rang. It was my mom. Her voice was full of shock and suspicion. "Where did you get the money for that supercar?" "We need to talk. Emergency family meeting tomorrow at 7 p.m. Be there." I had already cut off contact with them secretly weeks earlier. They didn't know. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. Over the past several years, my routine in Minneapolis had settled into a predictable pattern that left little room for family drama. I woke up early most mornings in my apartment downtown, grabbed coffee from the same shop near the river, and drove to the tech campus where I worked as a software engineer. The job paid well and demanded focus, which suited me because it kept my mind occupied on code instead of old family patterns. My parents still lived in the same two-story house in Edina where I grew up. The neighborhood featured wide streets lined with mature trees and well-kept lawns that reflected the comfortable middle-class life they had built. William Foster worked as a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company until he retired early. Elizabeth Foster had spent most of her time managing the household and supporting various community activities. They had raised three children with clear expectations about success and contribution. Nolan Foster, my older brother, was the first to leave home after college. At 35, he now managed a logistics team at a distribution center on the outskirts of the Twin Cities. He kept in touch with everyone but rarely took sides in any disagreement. His calm demeanor made him the default peacemaker whenever tensions rose, though he preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Bailey Foster arrived 5 years after me. From the moment she could hold a crayon, my parents treated her differently. They enrolled her in every art class available and praised her drawings as signs of exceptional talent. William often said she possessed a rare creative spark that needed protection. Elizabeth organized playdates around Bailey's schedule and made sure her supplies were always the best quality. As Bailey grew older, the attention intensified. High school meant private lessons with local artists, weekends at workshops, and family conversations that revolved around her latest project or upcoming exhibition. I watched these patterns solidify without much protest at first. My own achievements in math and science earned polite nods, but never the same level of excitement. When I graduated with honors and landed my first engineering internship, the celebration lasted one evening. When Bailey won a regional art contest the same year, the entire family attended the awards ceremony and framed the certificate for the living room wall. College brought more of the same contrast. I attended the University of Minnesota on a combination of scholarships and part-time jobs. I studied computer science and graduated with minimal debt. My parents helped with textbooks once or twice, but emphasized that I seemed capable of handling things independently. Bailey chose an art program at a smaller private college. William and Elizabeth covered most of her tuition and living expenses without hesitation. They explained their decision by pointing to her obvious passion and the unpredictable nature of creative careers. After graduation, I moved into my current apartment and focused on building my career. I took on extra projects, learned new programming languages, and earned steady promotions. The work satisfied me because each completed system represented tangible progress I could measure. Colleagues respected my reliability and often asked me to lead debugging sessions when deadlines approached. Meanwhile, Bailey pursued opportunities in the local arts scene. She rented a small studio space in a converted warehouse near the Mississippi and spent long hours developing her portfolio. My parents visited her frequently, bringing groceries and offering encouragement. They spoke about her future exhibitions with genuine pride and sometimes asked me to contribute ideas for promotional materials since I understood digital tools. Nolan maintained his own balance. He joined family dinners when invited and listened to everyone's updates. He occasionally suggested that all three siblings should support one another equally, but the suggestion never gained much traction. His own life centered on work and a quiet social circle that rarely overlapped with ours. I never resented the difference in treatment enough to start arguments. Instead, I channeled energy into my job and personal goals. Savings grew steadily in my accounts. I paid off my student loans ahead of schedule and began planning for larger purchases that would mark my independence. The routine felt stable even if the underlying family dynamic remained unchanged. Elizabeth handled most communication between us. She sent group texts about holidays and occasional health updates on William. William preferred shorter calls and focused on practical matters like car maintenance or home repairs. Bailey shared photos of her latest pieces and asked for feedback that I usually provided politely. Nolan checked in every few weeks with casual questions about my projects. This arrangement continued without major disruption until external pressures began to test its limits. The company I worked for secured a major contract that required extended hours and intense collaboration. I contributed significantly to the architecture of the new platform and received recognition from leadership. The experience reinforced my confidence in my abilities and reminded me that consistent effort produced reliable results. At the same time, Bailey prepared for her first solo exhibition at a gallery in the Minneapolis Arts District. The planning consumed family attention for weeks. Elizabeth coordinated catering and invitations, while William reviewed the budget for framing and lighting. Conversations at Sunday dinners centered on logistics and potential buyers. I attended planning meetings when asked, but felt increasingly like an observer rather than a participant. The contrast became more noticeable during those months. My own workload increased yet received little mention. Bailey's creative process dominated discussions and justified extra financial support. My parents justified the imbalance by repeating that her path required more encouragement because artistic success depended on visibility and connections. I accepted the explanation outwardly while noting the pattern internally. Nolan observed the same dynamics but commented only sparingly. He once mentioned during a private conversation that every family seemed to have a favored member and that fairness was difficult to enforce. His words carried no judgment yet highlighted the reality we all navigated differently. My daily commute from downtown to the tech campus gave me time to reflect on these matters without emotional intensity. The Minnesota winters tested patience with early darkness and icy roads, but the job provided structure that felt rewarding. I developed friendships with teammates who shared similar professional ambitions and understood the demands of deadline-driven work. Evenings often involved reviewing code or learning new frameworks online. I avoided heavy involvement in family matters to preserve my own energy. The separation between my professional life and home life in Adena created a buffer that allowed me to function effectively. This foundation of independence and routine formed the background against which later events unfolded. The patterns established over years shaped how each family member responded when circumstances shifted unexpectedly. I continued my work with focus and discipline, unaware that small cracks in the established order would soon widen under pressure from unmet expectations and hidden financial decisions. When my 33rd birthday arrived, the familiar pattern repeated itself in a way that felt heavier this time. The morning started like any other weekday in Minneapolis. I checked my phone right after waking up and found the usual silence from my family. No happy birthday message from mom or dad, no quick text from Nolan wishing me well, nothing at all from Bailey either. I told myself it was probably because they were busy, but the empty inbox still sat heavy in my chest as I got ready for work. By the time I reached the office, the day had already moved on without any acknowledgement. My team had a small cake waiting at my desk because they remembered the date from the company calendar. We shared a few laughs during the afternoon break, and that was the only celebration I received. The contrast with how my family handled Bailey's milestones made the quiet even louder. That evening, I drove the usual route home and decided to stop by the house in Edina unannounced. The lights were on, and I could hear voices inside as I walked up the driveway. When I opened the door, the living room was covered with large canvases and art supplies. Bailey stood in the middle, explaining her vision for the upcoming solo exhibition, while Mom and Dad listened with full attention. William nodded enthusiastically and offered to help with the framing costs. Elizabeth took notes on a pad about which pieces should go first in the gallery layout. They looked up when I stepped inside, but the conversation barely paused. Mom gave me a quick hug and said, "Oh, Tanner, you're here," before turning straight back to Bailey's sketches. Dad asked if I wanted coffee, but his eyes stayed on the display board they had set up. Nolan arrived a few minutes later carrying takeout bags, and he greeted me with a casual "Hey, Tanner," before joining the discussion about lighting options for the show. Bailey barely glanced my way as she described how the exhibition would highlight her latest series on urban isolation. I sat on the edge of the couch and listened while the minutes ticked by. No one mentioned the date. No one brought out a card or even a small gesture. The focus remained entirely on Bailey's big opportunity and how the family could make sure it succeeded. William mentioned adjusting his schedule to attend every preview event. Elizabeth talked about contacting local media contacts she knew through her community groups. Nolan offered to help transport the larger pieces in his truck. The longer I sat there, the clearer the pattern became. My own birthday had slipped through the cracks again because Bailey's creative needs took priority. I kept my expression neutral and asked a couple of polite questions about the exhibition dates just to stay part of the room. Mom answered briefly and then shifted the topic back to which gallery owner might be interested. When I finally left the house later that night, the drive back to my apartment felt longer than 20 minutes. The quiet in my car matched the quiet on my phone. I replayed the evening in my head and felt the familiar mix of acceptance and frustration settle in. I had learned over the years that pointing out the imbalance only led to defensive explanations about Bailey being the one who needed extra support. So I kept those thoughts to myself and focused on the one thing I could control. The next day at work, the company announced the results of the major project I had led for the past 6 months. Leadership called a short all-hands meeting and recognized several team members for their contributions. When my name came up, they highlighted the complex architecture I designed and the way it helped the platform scale beyond initial projections. The bonus that followed was substantial enough to mark a real milestone in my career. I received the deposit notification on my phone during lunch and stared at the amount for a long moment. Colleagues congratulated me in the break room and someone suggested we grab drinks after work to celebrate. I smiled and agreed, but inside I wondered what my family would say if they knew. The previous evening had shown me exactly where their attention lay. I decided not to mention the bonus during our next group chat. There was no point adding it to a conversation that would likely circle back to Bailey's exhibition anyway. Instead, I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the deposit details and thinking about what the extra money could mean for my own plans. The achievement felt solid because it came from my own effort and the recognition came from people who valued results over creative flair. It stood in sharp contrast to the way my family measured success at home. That weekend, the family group texts lit up with more details about Bailey's show. Mom sent photos of the final invitation design and asked everyone to confirm their availability for the opening night. Dad replied that he had already cleared his calendar. Nolan said he would bring extra help for setup. Bailey posted a short video of her arranging the pieces in the studio, and the responses poured in with encouragement and praise. I read through the messages while sitting at my kitchen counter. My own birthday had come and gone without a single line in that same chat. The bonus I received sat in my account as proof that I could create value on my own terms, yet it remained invisible to the people who had raised me. I typed a short reply confirming I would attend the opening and left it at that. The following week passed in a steady rhythm of work and reflection. The bonus gave me a quiet sense of security that I had earned through consistent performance rather than family support. I started researching options for a larger personal purchase but kept the details private. The emotional weight of the ignored birthday lingered, but it also sharpened my resolve to handle my own milestones moving forward. By the end of the month, the exhibition preparations had reached a fever pitch at the house in Edina. Elizabeth sent daily updates about vendor confirmations and guest list RSVPs. William reviewed the budget one more time and confirmed he could cover the additional printing costs. Nolan helped Bailey transport several pieces and shared photos of the progress in the group chat. I viewed the updates from my desk at the office and noted how naturally the family rallied around her moment. My own recent success at work received no mention in any of those exchanges. The bonus had come and gone without fanfare because it did not fit the narrative of needing extra encouragement. I accepted that reality with a calm that surprised even me. The pattern had repeated itself once again, but this time the quiet acknowledgement of my independence felt like the beginning of something different. I continued my daily routine with the same focus that had carried me through the project. The contrast between my professional life and the family dynamic in Edina had never been clearer. One delivered measurable results and recognition while the other offered silence on the days that mattered to me. A couple of days after that quiet birthday, the idea took shape in my mind during a routine morning drive. I had been thinking about making a significant personal purchase for months, and the recent deposit gave me the freedom to act without hesitation. After researching options online and visiting a dealership on the edge of the metro area, I made the decision. The supercar sat gleaming under the showroom lights, and I completed the paperwork with a calm focus. Payment cleared in full from my own account, and the keys were handed over that same afternoon. Driving it back toward Minneapolis felt different from any commute I had known before. The engine responded smoothly, and the interior offered a level of comfort that matched the achievement behind the purchase. I kept the windows up and the music low as I navigated familiar highways. No one in my family knew about the transaction, and I intended to keep it that way for the time being. That evening, I parked the supercar in my assigned spot at the apartment complex and took a few moments to look at it under the overhead lights. It represented more than transportation. It stood as proof of years of steady effort that no one else had tracked closely. I pulled out my phone and took one simple photo from a modest angle. The image captured the sleek lines without any dramatic staging. I uploaded it to a private account visible only to a small circle of trusted contacts and left the caption blank. The act felt deliberate and final. I had reached a point where external validation no longer drove my choices. The silence around my birthday had clarified what I needed to protect. From that moment, I began adjusting my communication habits in small but meaningful ways. I muted the family group chat without leaving it. Notifications from mom and dad went to a separate folder. Messages from Nolan and Bailey received the same treatment. I did not block anyone outright, but I stopped responding promptly and eventually stopped responding at all. The process happened gradually over the following week. When mom sent a text asking about my weekend plans, I read it and set the phone aside. When dad forwarded an article about local events, I glanced at the headline and continued with my evening. Bailey shared another update about her exhibition preparations, and I viewed the photos without replying. Nolan checked in with his usual casual tone, and I let the message sit unanswered. Each muted interaction reinforced the boundary I was setting. The supercar remained parked downstairs, and I drove it to work a few times during the week. Colleagues noticed the change and offered compliments during parking lot conversations. I thanked them politely but kept details minimal. The purchase stayed private because sharing it would only invite questions I no longer wanted to answer. Evenings in the apartment took on a quieter rhythm. I reviewed project notes from the office and planned upcoming tasks without the usual interruptions from family messages. The absence of constant updates from Adina created space I had not realized I needed. I used that space to reflect on the patterns I had accepted for so long. The decision to step back felt necessary rather than dramatic. Midweek, I received a short voicemail from mom asking if everything was okay since she had not heard back. I listened to it once and deleted it without calling back. The same pattern continued with the others. Nolan sent a meme about Monday mornings, and Bailey forwarded a link to an art event. I saw each notification but chose silence. By the end of the week, the cutoff had become nearly complete. I still received messages, but I no longer engaged. The supercar sat as a quiet symbol of that shift. I had paid for it with money earned through my own work, and I intended to enjoy it on my own terms. No explanations, no justifications. Just the simple act of moving forward without the weight of old expectations. The following days passed with the same deliberate distance. I maintained my professional responsibilities with the same reliability that had earned the recent recognition. Outside of work, I explored new routes around the city in the supercar and enjoyed the freedom it provided. The Minnesota air carried the first hints of changing seasons, and the drives offered moments of clear thinking. I never announced the change to anyone. The decision remained internal, and the actions spoke for themselves. Messages continued to arrive at a slower pace as my family noticed the lack of replies. I observed the shift without guilt or second thoughts. The boundary had been necessary for too long, and the recent events had finally pushed me to enforce it. The supercar became part of my daily life without fanfare. I kept it clean and maintained according to the dealership schedule. Colleagues asked occasional questions, and I answered briefly before changing the subject. The private photo remained online, but I did not add more images or draw attention to it. This period of quiet independence solidified something important. I had taken a concrete step toward living on my own terms, and the silence from my end marked the beginning of a new chapter. The family in Adina continued their routines, and I continued mine with one significant difference. The connection had been intentionally loosened, and I felt no urge to tighten it again. Only one day later, my phone rang with an unexpected call from mom. I was sitting at my desk reviewing code when her name appeared on the screen. The tone in her voice carried a mix of confusion and urgency right from the first sentence. She asked directly where the money for the supercar had come from and why she had seen the image circulating through a mutual acquaintance's feed. Before I could respond, she mentioned receiving an email from the insurance company confirming the new policy under my name. Her questions came quickly, and she insisted we needed to discuss the matter as a family. She set the emergency meeting for the following evening at 7 p.m. at the house in Edina and made it clear that everyone should attend. I listened without interrupting as she repeated her concern about the sudden large purchase. When she paused, I simply acknowledged the message and ended the call. The conversation left a clear tension in the air that I had anticipated, but not in this exact form. After hanging up, I opened my banking app and began a thorough review of recent activity. The record showed several withdrawals from a joint savings account I had set up years earlier for emergency purposes. The amounts had been transferred in small increments over the past months, and the descriptions were vague enough to avoid immediate notice. Further checks revealed charges on a credit card that still listed me as the primary holder. Those charges aligned with art supply purchases, studio rent payments, and promotional materials for Bailey's projects. I downloaded statements and screenshots of every transaction. The pattern became obvious once I laid the documents side by side. Funds had been moved without my knowledge or consent to support Bailey's upcoming exhibition and related expenses. The total reached a significant figure that explained Mom's alarmed reaction to the supercar. I saved everything into a secure folder and cross-checked dates against my own records to ensure accuracy. The discovery brought a quiet anger that I kept controlled. I had maintained that account as a safety net, and the credit card had remained open for occasional shared family needs that rarely materialized. Now both had been used in ways that directly contradicted the independence I had worked to establish. I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the evidence into a clear timeline that showed the sequence of transfers and charges. Later that evening, I reviewed the insurance email Mom had mentioned. It confirmed the policy details for the new vehicle and listed my contact information as the owner. The timing aligned perfectly with the online photo and explained how the information reached her. I forwarded the email to my own secure address for additional records and noted the exact time it had been sent. The next morning, I continued preparing for the meeting while handling my regular work tasks. Colleagues noticed I seemed more focused than usual, but I kept the reason private. During lunch, I double-checked all the downloaded documents and added notes about specific conversations where financial support for Bailey had been discussed openly in the past. The evidence formed a consistent picture that left little room for denial. By mid-afternoon, I had compiled everything into a single presentation file that was easy to navigate. Each page included dates, amounts, and brief explanations without emotional language. I tested the file on my laptop to make sure it opened correctly and printed 2 backup copies just in case. The preparation felt methodical and necessary given what I had uncovered. As the day progressed, I considered how the family might respond. Mom's call had already shown her surprise and suspicion. Dad would likely focus on practical explanations while defending Bailey's needs. Nolan might try to calm the situation with his usual balanced approach. Bailey herself would probably emphasize the importance of her creative work. I anticipated the common justifications but remained resolved to present the facts clearly. I left work a bit earlier than normal to allow time for the drive to Adina. Traffic moved steadily, and I used the time to run through the key points in my mind. The supercar remained parked at my apartment, and I drove my regular vehicle to avoid drawing extra attention before the meeting. The evening light faded as I approached the familiar neighborhood streets. Upon arriving at the house, I parked in the driveway and took a moment to gather the printed materials. The front door opened before I reached it, and Mom greeted me with a concerned expression. She mentioned again how shocked she had been to see the supercar and asked once more about the source of the funds. I replied calmly that we could discuss everything inside with the rest of the family. William waited in the living room along with Nolan and Bailey. The atmosphere felt charged as everyone took seats around the main table. I placed the folder of documents in front of me and waited for the conversation to begin. The meeting had been called because of the visible purchase, but the real issues ran much deeper. I sat quietly while the initial questions started and prepared to address each one with the evidence I had compiled. The discovery of the unauthorized transactions had shifted my perspective in a permanent way. What began as a simple reaction to the supercar had revealed a longer pattern of financial decisions made without consultation. I felt ready to lay out the complete picture when the discussion turned to the reasons behind the meeting. The evening of the meeting arrived, and I walked into the house in Edina carrying the folder of documents. Everyone had already gathered in the dining room when I entered. William sat at the head of the table with a serious expression while Elizabeth paced near the window. Nolan stood by the sideboard pouring water into glasses, and Bailey sat with her arms crossed, looking impatient. The tension filled the room before any words were spoken. I took my usual seat and placed the folder in front of me without opening it yet. Mom started the conversation immediately by repeating her shock at seeing the supercar and the insurance email. She asked again how I could afford such a vehicle and whether I had taken on debt without telling the family. Dad nodded along and added that large purchases like that required careful planning, especially at my age. Bailey rolled her eyes and muttered that some people always found ways to make everything about themselves. I waited until they finished the initial questions, then opened the folder and slid printed statements across the table. The first pages showed the series of transfers from the savings account I had maintained for years. Each line listed dates and amounts that matched art supply orders and studio payments. The second set of documents detailed the credit card charges under my name that covered framing costs, promotional printing, and gallery fees. I pointed out the timeline without raising my voice and explained that none of the transactions had received my approval. Elizabeth's face changed as she scanned the papers. She looked at William and then back at me while insisting that the money had been used to support Bailey's important opportunity. She described how Bailey's talent needed every possible advantage in a competitive field and that small contributions from family accounts were normal when one child showed exceptional promise. William agreed and said creative careers demanded more investment than steady office jobs because success depended on visibility and timing. Bailey spoke up next, defending the expenses as essential for her exhibition. She argued that without proper materials and promotion, her work would go unnoticed, and the family had always helped each other in times of need. Her tone carried the familiar mix of entitlement and justification I had heard many times before. Nolan tried to intervene by suggesting we focus on finding a solution rather than assigning blame. He proposed reviewing the total amount and creating a repayment plan that everyone could agree on. His voice remained calm as he reminded us that families should work through financial misunderstandings together. For a moment, the room quieted, but the underlying positions stayed firm. I responded by asking why the transfers happened without any discussion or request for permission. Mom replied that they assumed I would understand given how stable my career appeared and how much Bailey needed the boost. Dad added that I had always been responsible and therefore required less direct support compared to my sister's unpredictable path. Elizabeth reinforced the point by saying Bailey's genius deserved protection while my job provided its own security. The conversation grew more heated as I pressed for acknowledgement that using my name and accounts without consent crossed a clear line. Bailey accused me of being selfish for making an issue out of help that benefited the whole family's pride in her success. William warned that bringing up these matters now could damage relationships over something that could be resolved quietly. Nolan attempted another mediation by proposing we set new rules for shared accounts moving forward, but his suggestion received little engagement. I laid out the full impact by noting how the combined transfers affected my own financial position and trust within the family. Mom's eyes showed a flash of guilt before she returned to defending the choices as necessary for Bailey's future exhibitions and potential career breakthrough. Dad emphasized practical realities by saying artistic talent like Bailey's came once in a lifetime and required collective sacrifice. The exchange continued with each side repeating core arguments in different forms. Elizabeth highlighted past instances where the family had supported my education indirectly while focusing most resources on Bailey's needs. Bailey claimed her contributions through art brought intangible value that outweighed monetary concerns. Nolan kept trying to steer toward compromise, but the emotional undercurrents made progress difficult. I maintained a steady tone while addressing each justification with specific examples from the documents. The room temperature seemed to rise as voices overlapped and gestures became more animated. William eventually called for a brief pause, but the break did little to ease the atmosphere when discussion resumed. By the later part of the meeting, the core conflict stood exposed without resolution. The family's longstanding preference for supporting Bailey's creative pursuits had collided directly with my expectation of consent and transparency in financial matters. Nolan's attempts at balance highlighted the difficulty of bridging such entrenched views in one conversation. Elizabeth concluded her defense by stating that true family loyalty meant prioritizing the member with the greatest need at any given time. Dad nodded in agreement while Bailey sat straighter with a look of vindication. I listened to the final remarks and realized the depth of the divide that had grown over the years. The meeting ended without any agreement on repayment or changes to how decisions would be made in the future. Everyone stood up with unresolved tension hanging in the air. I gathered my documents and left the house that night, knowing the confrontation had clarified positions that had remained unspoken for too long. Right after leaving the house that night, the weight of the conversation settled in during the drive home. I reached my apartment and sat in the parking lot for several minutes before going upstairs. The events of the evening replayed in my mind with sharp clarity. No one had taken responsibility for the unauthorized transfers or offered a concrete plan to make things right. Instead, the focus had remained on defending Bailey's needs and questioning my reaction. That realization made the next steps feel inevitable. The following morning, I systematically removed all connections. I blocked mom's number first, then dad's and Bailey's. Nolan's contact went last because his attempts at balance had always seemed the most sincere, yet even he had not challenged the core imbalance. The group chat disappeared from my phone, and I adjusted privacy settings so no one could see my updates or location. The silence that replaced the constant notifications brought an immediate sense of control. Work provided a welcome distraction in the days that followed. I threw myself into upcoming deadlines and team meetings with extra energy. Colleagues commented on my increased productivity, but I kept the reasons private. The routine of debugging code and planning system improvements helped create distance from the family tension that now existed only in Adina. Nolan reached out through a coworker's number a few days later. He left a message saying he understood my frustration and wanted to find a middle ground. I listened to the recording once and deleted it without responding. His persistence showed his character, but I had already decided that middle ground no longer existed for me. The patterns were too deeply rooted to change through one conversation or even several. Mom tried traditional mail next. A handwritten letter arrived expressing worry about my sudden withdrawal and suggesting we all sit down again with cooler heads. She mentioned missing our regular updates and hoped the family could move past the disagreement. I read the note carefully before placing it aside unanswered. The words carried familiar tones of concern mixed with the same underlying defense of past choices. Inside the house in Adina, the atmosphere grew strained, according to what I later heard through distant connections. William and Elizabeth argued about how to handle the financial shortfall now that the transfers had been exposed. Bailey continued preparing for her exhibition, but the usual family support felt fractured. Nolan attempted to keep communication open between everyone, but found himself caught in the middle of growing resentments. I used the time to strengthen my personal security. Bank accounts received new passwords and alerts for any unusual activity. The old shared savings account was formally closed, and any remaining links to family members were severed. These steps felt practical and protective rather than punitive. They reflected a clear boundary that had been necessary for years. Nolan made one more effort by visiting my apartment complex without warning. He waited in the lobby and asked the front desk to calm me down. When I came downstairs, he spoke calmly about the tension at home and his hope that I would reconsider the total cutoff. He described how mom had become anxious and dad had started questioning some of their earlier decisions. I listened without interruption, then explained that the meeting had simply revealed what had been true for a long time. After a short exchange, I wished him well and returned to my apartment alone. The complete separation took hold after that encounter. No more attempts from any family member reached me directly. I deleted old photos and messages that might trigger unnecessary reflection. My daily life in Minneapolis continued with work, occasional drives, and quiet evenings that no longer included checking the family group for updates. Weeks passed and the absence of contact became the new normal. I heard indirectly that the exhibition had gone forward, but with less family involvement than planned. William reportedly looked into loans to cover remaining costs, while Elizabeth focused on maintaining appearances within their social circle. Bailey expressed frustration about the lack of unified support but continued her creative work. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering sadness during those early weeks of true independence. The drama from the meeting had forced a permanent break that removed the constant undercurrent of comparison and justification. My focus shifted entirely to personal goals and professional growth without the background noise of family expectations. The decision to cut ties completely had not come lightly, but the events surrounding the meeting left no other viable path. Each blocked number and unanswered message reinforced the boundary I had finally enforced. Life moved forward in Minneapolis with a clarity that had been missing for years. 3 months passed and the full impact of those decisions became clear for everyone involved. The house in Edina sold to a young couple relocating for work opportunities in the Twin Cities. William and Elizabeth accepted an offer below their initial asking price because the timeline for settling outstanding balances had grown urgent. Moving out required sorting through decades of belongings in a short window, and the process highlighted how intertwined their financial choices had become with daily life. The proceeds went primarily toward clearing debts accumulated from the unauthorized transfers and additional loans taken to maintain appearances during the transition. Credit reports reflected the strain as scores dropped across multiple accounts. Late fees and interest charges compounded the original amounts and limited options for new financing or everyday flexibility. Elizabeth adjusted her community involvement to a lower profile while William took on occasional consulting work to supplement retirement income. The comfortable suburban routine they had maintained for years now operated under tighter constraints that affected everything from household expenses to planned travel. Bailey adapted to the new circumstances by securing part-time positions at two different galleries in the Minneapolis Arts District. The roles involved customer assistance, inventory management, and basic administrative tasks alongside her continued creative efforts. Studio rent and material costs now came from her own earnings rather than family support, and she learned to prioritize projects that fit within realistic budgets. The shift brought practical challenges she had not encountered when resources flowed more freely, but it also fostered a different kind of resilience in her approach to art. Nolan continued his logistics role with steady hours and used his position to help coordinate some of the moving logistics during the house sale. He maintained limited contact with each family member but observed the collective adjustment without attempting further mediation. The experience appeared to reinforce his preference for keeping professional and personal matters separate whenever possible. In Minneapolis, my days followed a consistent rhythm that felt increasingly aligned with my own priorities. Work remained demanding yet rewarding with new responsibilities that built directly on previous successes. I upgraded my living space with small improvements funded entirely through personal earnings and enjoyed the freedom to make choices without external expectations. The supercar continued to serve as reliable transportation for both daily commutes and occasional weekend escapes to quieter areas outside the metro. Social connections expanded naturally as more time became available for friendships and activities that had previously taken second place. Weekend gatherings with colleagues or neighbors focused on shared interests rather than family obligations, and conversations carried a lighter tone, free from underlying tensions. The absence of regular updates from Medina created mental space that allowed clearer focus on long-term goals, including further career development and personal interests. Reflecting on the entire sequence, I recognized how the patterns of favoritism had operated for years under the assumption that my stability meant I required less attention or support. The events surrounding the large purchase simply brought those assumptions into sharp view and forced a permanent separation. Maintaining no contact eliminated the cycle of justifications and emotional drain that had accompanied every previous disagreement. The real lesson lies in understanding that some family dynamics resist meaningful change even when facts are presented openly. When trust has been eroded through repeated unilateral decisions, especially involving finances, the most effective response is often to establish clear and permanent boundaries. This does not mean harboring anger, but rather choosing to invest energy in your own growth instead of attempting to correct imbalances that others may never acknowledge. Many people experience similar situations where one sibling receives disproportionate resources under the label of special talent or need, while others are expected to manage independently. The key insight is that your worth does not depend on family validation or equal treatment. Protecting your financial security, emotional well-being, and future opportunities becomes essential when continued involvement only reinforces harmful patterns. I no longer feel the pull to check on their well-being or consider reconciliation. The distance has brought genuine peace and a stronger sense of self that comes from living according to personal standards rather than inherited roles. The family in Edina continues adjusting to their new realities, while I move forward in Minneapolis with clarity and purpose. This chapter closed without dramatic reconciliation or restored relationships. Instead, it ended with practical consequences that matched the choices made over time, and a quiet acceptance that some separations serve everyone better in the long run. The experience underscores the importance of recognizing when accommodation has crossed into self-neglect and having the courage to step away. Ultimately, each person holds responsibility for their own path. When family systems prioritize one member at the expense of another, the healthiest action is often to build independence outside that system. I chose that path, and the months since have confirmed it as the right decision for my life.